I love Assassin's Creed 3. It may be my favourite game in the entire Assassin's Creed franchise. Say that 10 years ago and you get some strange stares and a lot of pushback, but say that now and people will roll their eyes because here comes another one. I can't think of another game that's had such a dramatic change in public opinion over the years, but Assassin's Creed 3 has aged like fine wine. The game was never considered bad, at least not by professional critics, but it was generally considered one of the weaker titles in the series. It was boring, oddly paced, and a massive downer with an unlikable protagonist. And a strange ending for the tale of Desmond, a thing we definitely cared about, right? It was also burdened by a lot of franchise expectation. It was the follow-up to Ezio, 3 games with one of the now most iconic characters in video games. But 4 games in, and the series was already being hit with accusations of creative stagnation, and while the game certainly takes many swings to address that on the gameplay side, it's really the story where AC3 takes its biggest risk, because it's the first game in the series to really fully engage with the politics of its historical setting. And that makes it by far the most interesting. I have talked about this game before, so unfortunately if you've watched that old video, I am unavoidably going to end up repeating myself for a lot of this stuff. But hey, I'm better at this now and I actually cite sources now, like this one. Look, I just cited myself, what a narcissist I am. I was pretty thorough in that old video, but there is so much to Assassin's Creed 3 that was beyond the scope of that video, so this time, we're going all in. Like a lot of people, it was the 2019 remaster that brought me back to Assassin's Creed 3 and caused me to reevaluate my thoughts on the game, because back in 2012, I was on board the hate train like everyone else. The setting is boring, Connor is boring, and it's just kind of dull. I think part of that shift is just that I've grown up since then. I enjoy the more mature themes of the game than I did as a wee child. But I think the bigger deal is... what's the best way to put this? The global perception of America has changed a lot since 2012. And with that, the way that we talk about American history has changed a lot as well. Now, it probably goes without saying that I'm no American, right? But America is just such a completely unavoidable country if you engage with any form of pulp culture. Most of our movies are made and set there, most of our games are made and set there. Even without living there, most of the English-speaking world is absolutely saturated in American culture. In 2012, America's vision of itself was very, shall we say, patriotic. America, the greatest country on earth. And that rah-rah philosophy absolutely influenced the way they talked about their history. The founding fathers of America were the greatest men who ever lived, and they fought for freedom and liberty to create the greatest country the world has ever known. And that is not the version of history that Assassin's Creed 3 portrays. There was an impression by some critics that that's what the game was going to be. When the first trailers for the game dropped, the game was even criticised of having an anti-British bias, which is frankly just a hilarious thing to complain about. But those critiques fell to the wayside pretty quickly once the game actually came out. Assassin's Creed 3 draws massive focus on the ironies of history with its deliberate choice to star a Native American protagonist. That a war that was ostensibly fought for freedom ended up taking away that freedom from a lot of people. Shining a light on the way that America, and Canada too, we're not exempt, historically treated and still to this day treats Native Americans. I think in 2012, the world was not quite ready for that kind of story. But in 2019, after 3 years of Trump and the total deconstruction of American values he brought with him, that hard edge of Assassin's Creed 3 went down a heck of a lot smoother. It's still a video game with plenty of flaws, particularly when it comes to the actual being a video game side of things. But its willingness to engage with the messiness of its historical setting, showcasing a time period where great men and monsters were one and the same, makes Assassin's Creed 3 stand out not just amongst the rest of the franchise, but amongst the gaming landscape at large. There are few games as politically charged as Assassin's Creed 3. It's also a game where a dude touches a magic ball to stop the world from being destroyed by solar flares, because Assassin's Creed. So, without further ado, let's talk about one of the greatest hot messes in the entire games industry. Let's talk about Assassin's Creed 3.
Used to be when people talked about the end of the world, we locked them up. Or laughed them off. Sometimes both. But we never took them seriously. Maybe we should have. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Better to start at the beginning, with the abduction of Desmond Miles, my son.
As you might expect, Assassin's Creed 3 starts with the longest and most elaborate recap of the entire series, which I think more than anything is really starting to show the baggage of continually chugging along with Desmond and the gang. Because John Delancey sure has a lot of things he needs to explain before the plot of this game makes any sort of sense to new players. It is especially funny to think about the fact that within the universe, even though it's been 5 years and 4 games, to Desmond, the events of Assassin's Creed 1 only happened 3 weeks ago. Assassin's Creed 3 technically has the highest stakes and most action-packed inclusion of any of the modern-day games. It's an end-of-the-world story where Desmond and the gang only have about a month to prevent the solar apocalypse, which as far as stakes go, you don't really get much higher. And it's all based around a real thing that will probably get lost to history as the years go by. There was, I guess the best word for it is a conspiracy theory, that the world was going to end on December 21st, 2012, because that's when the ancient Mayan calendar ended, and I know that sounds like an insane fringe nonsense thing to say, but there were movies about this, several documentaries, people sold their houses and spent their last days on Earth on a big blowout vacation. This became such a big deal that NASA had to put out an official statement assuring people that no, the world was not going to end just because the Mayans 5,000 years ago stopped counting days into the future. Since the second game, this has been the framework of the Desmond saga. It was all building up to this apocalypse, and in fact, in Desley's original vision for the series, it was going to be unavoidable. Desmond and the gang would take down Abstergo, and then the world would end, and Desmond and Lucy would go up in a spaceship to become the new Adam and Eve for a new beginning of humanity on a new world. That obviously didn't happen, and honestly, thank God, because that sounds dumb as hell. It would have fit with Desley's insistence that the series was sci-fi and not historical fiction, but by Assassin's Creed 3 the franchise is well and truly not Desley's baby anymore. People tend to get very protective over an original creator's intended vision. Star Wars is a good example. How some people cling to George Lucas as the one true Star Wars creator, and anything not made with his direct involvement is just fan fiction. But if reading up on the original plans for Assassin's Creed is proof of anything, it's that sometimes the first plan isn't actually the best plan. I can only imagine the cultural legacy of Assassin's Creed if the franchise ended with the world blowing up and Desmond Miles becoming the new progenitor of humanity. But I think it would probably be watch module lists about the weirdest endings in video games. So what does happen to Desmond in his final outing? Well, a surprisingly large amount of stuff, actually. In terms of screen time, Desmond in the modern day have more to do in Assassin's Creed 3 than any of the other games. There are a lot more modern day interludes than before, including a lot more dialogue and a lot more magical space princess. And even field missions where Desmond goes out into the real world to do real work instead of sitting in a chair like he has for the last 4 games. The gang have reached the Temple, the place Jupiter yelled at us about at the end of the last game. The place where the 3 precursors who've hunted us through these games work together to try and come up with a solution to the Sun Apocalypse problem. The Apple of Eden opens the first door, but the second door requires a second key, which is the explanation this time around for why Desmond is living through his ancestors' memories. However, the temple also needs batteries. Big glowy cube things that for reasons I don't understand are scattered around the world. Which is why Desmond needs to go on an excursion to find them. Once he does, Juno will pop up to give some history lessons about the various failed ideas to prevent the apocalypse that they tried and gave up on. This is a significant step up from any of the previous games aside from maybe Brotherhood, when the modern day segment's mostly considered of waking up sometimes to have a chat. Does that finally make Desmond's story worth discussing in any meaningful way? Kind of. It's his last game, maybe I owe the guy that much. To its credit, I do actually think the modern day stuff in Assassin's Creed 3 is fairly well written, despite everything going against it, like killing one of the main characters for a paycheck. It understands that the drama of an end-of-the-world story isn't actually the end of the world, but how people react to it. It reveals a person's true colours. The normally chill, vaguely stoner-coded Rebecca spends most of the game on the verge of a total emotional breakdown, while Sean triples down on being a snarky bastard to avoid having any meaningful conversations about it. Desmond and his dad, on the other hand, provide a thematic through-line with the past storyline, because both Desmond in the modern day and Connor in the past are dealing with some major daddy issues. The apocalypse is a good driver to reconcile their differences and try to be a family again, even in their strange circumstances. Assassin's Creed 3 actually does a much better job than any game in the series of interweaving its themes between the past and present storylines. Desmond remains to the very end a generic block of wood, but at the very least in this game he's a driven block of wood who actually makes his own decisions for once in the series, which is nice. And as far as all the ancient precursor race stuff goes, Juno is by far the most interesting of them, because beyond being a helpful ghost, she's clearly working towards her own agenda and her own ambitions. And you have no choice but to help her if you want to have any chance of preventing the Sun Apocalypse. Her stories about their experiments to prevent it the first time were also just generally kind of interesting, as their methods got darker and darker as the end times drew nearer. This is not to say that I think the modern day segments are all that worthwhile. I still feel ultimately that they're a distraction from the real draw of the game. But at the very least, if you're invested in the modern day side of the story, this game does its best to make it a satisfying resolution.
Son?
Sir.
Here we go again.
History has always been the draw of the series, and that makes Assassin's Creed 3's choice of setting a very daring choice. Unlike the previous games, the American Revolution is clearly chosen less for the environment, like the big glamorous cities of Renaissance Italy, but for how this time period and the war in particular fit in with the overall narrative of the series. The Assassins fight for freedom against tyranny, and the Templars fight for order and control. The two organisations slot into the British-American conflict quite snugly, at least on the surface. But that apparent agreement between the philosophy of the Assassins and the philosophy of the Revolutionaries is exactly what the game seeks to deconstruct over the course of its runtime. And it's a long runtime. Assassin's Creed 3 was in development from the end of Assassin's Creed 2, and those extra years of development time show in the game's massively expanded scope and size compared to its predecessors. It's easily 3 times as big as Revelations. That size can be a detriment to some players because it's undeniable that on a purely visual level everything is a step down, not in terms of textures and models, but in terms of what you're actually looking at. Boston and New York are glamorous big cities today, but in the late 1700s they're nothing more than wood and stone row houses. They are extraordinarily humble compared to the glamour of Venice. And initially this can seem like a problem for the game. Assassin's Creed had cemented its identity as the series where you climb around on historic landmarks. And Assassin's Creed 3 just doesn't have very many landmarks because most of America's famous landmarks won't be built for another 100 years at least. To a primarily American, or at least English-speaking audience, America is also missing the exoticism of Italy. That's obviously a very biased view, but that doesn't mean it's not how people felt. Home is really an exotic place to explore, regardless of where you live. When I was a kid, the setting of Assassin's Creed 3 underwhelmed me quite a bit. If you just look at screenshots comparing it to the last game in terms of visual spectacle, it's obviously a massive downgrade. But I think now that's actually the point. Assassin's Creed 3's setting is about expanding the definitions of the Assassin's Creed franchise. Just because it's a series where you climb on all the buildings doesn't mean that has to be all that it is. That's why this game puts such a drastic focus on nature as an environment. Not all of human history takes place in well-built-up cities, and the series should be allowed to explore those alternate sides of history, even if they don't match up with the previously established rhythms of the series. Like the first game, Assassin's Creed 3 contains a massive sprawling countryside area connecting its major cities, the Frontier. But unlike the first game, where that was just a weird empty field to run through, the Frontier is actually the primary focus of the majority of the game's level design and technological improvements over the previous game. It's a space bigger than Brotherhood's Rome and absolutely full of detail. It's better to look at it as a kind of experiment, translating the rhythms of Assassin's Creed, climbing, stealth, combat, and recontextualizing them for an outdoors wilderness environment. You can't climb buildings out there, but you can climb trees and cliffs. Social stealth is out of the question because there's no people, but traditional stealth, hiding in bushes or stalking from the tree line, is functionally the same thing mechanically. There's less people out in the hills, but there's certainly a whole bunch of deadly nature out there instead. Assassin's Creed 3 simulates an entire ecosystem of animals on the frontier, with different animals that live in different regions of this fictional chunk of North America. The first time the series showed animals aside from horses. It simulates seasons as well. During certain chapters, winter comes and transforms the entire landscape to snow and ice. As an evolution of the series, this makes perfect sense. The only issue is that the Assassin's Creed franchise does not exist in a vacuum, and a focus on more natural environments in the grand scheme of video games actually makes Assassin's Creed 3 more generic. Wide open natural environments were and are the standard for open world games. Skyrim had just come out the previous year. A game with that same kind of focus on natural environments, or a game which absolutely looms large over Assassin's Creed 3 and will come up again, Rockstar's Red Dead Redemption. A game set in a wide-open, fictional chunk of America during an important period of American history. A game that also features multiple environments with a full animal hunting system. A game that also features a wide variety of period-accurate minigames to play. A game that also saw a studio mostly known for games in tight urban areas expand into wide frontier landscapes instead. The two games were in development at the same time, so no one's ripping off anyone here. It's just one of those strange coincidences that happen sometimes. But I think the comparison is absolutely illuminating in a lot of key ways. Because Red Dead Redemption was a critical darling and a fan favourite, and Assassin's Creed 3 was a black sheep. Why? What are the differences between these two games that are in concept so similar? One potential answer is the simplest and also the most boring, but it probably should be mentioned. Assassin's Creed 3 was, and is to this day, a gold standard for Ubisoft jank. It's full of bugs and weird glitches and problems that even the remaster can't hide. Red Dead has its fair share of jank too, but not nearly to the same extent as Assassin's Creed 3, which looks and feels like a game coming apart at the seams a lot of the time. I don't like that answer. That answer is boring, and I don't think it gets to the heart of the differences between the two games. I think the root of the difference in the reception to the two games comes from their approach to their respective histories, and more specifically, their perspectives. Red Dead is a western, and it takes its influences from famous western movies much more than it does from real history. John Marston is a gunslinger cut from the same cloth as any Clint Eastwood character. He's a very traditional protagonist in that way. He's charismatic, badass, very relatable, and yes, he is a gruff, rough and tough white dude. He is a vessel for the player in the same vein as Ezio, somebody designed to be easily likeable. Do not misconstrue me, I love John Marston. On the other hand, we have Raton Gedon, a young, brash, naive and introverted Kanai Kahaga warrior. A character designed from the ground up to be the opposite of Ezio in every way. A character completely distinct from basically any other game protagonist in existence. And people did not like him. Not at all. More than the game, it's the narrative around Connor himself that has shifted dramatically from the time of the game's launch. It used to be the dominant position that Connor sucked. He was bland, boring and annoying. Whereas nowadays we've reached that Ellen Ripley point where the bad side of the internet will use Connor as a positive example of when Assassin's Creed used to be good and not woke. Which in context is a completely ridiculous thing to say about Assassin's Creed 3, a game which if it came out today would be the centre of an absolute shitstorm from that same group of people. I'm not saying Connor was disliked because of racism, although let's not pretend there was none of that. When the game first came out, I was on the anti-Connor train too, and I think it comes down to the way I've framed this discussion. Connor was designed to be the opposite of Ezio. Ezio was a character designed to be easily likeable. And what's the opposite of an easily likeable character? A character who's hard to like. Connor does not have, as the kids say, or at least they did a year ago, I think, the riz. He's not a very charming guy. He's very blunt, kind of socially awkward, short-tempered, and for most of the game an idiot who lets himself get used and manipulated by people. And to top it all off, he has a strange, kind of stilted way of speaking.
Leaving home was harder than I thought. I expected the journey would fill me with a sort of pride, a sense of accomplishment. But whatever it was that carried me away from home soon fled, replaced by questions, and no small amount of doubt. Had I been too hasty? Had I made a mistake? The others in the village, they thought this was something I wanted, something I chose to do. But it never felt that way to me. No, it was not a choice. It was an obligation. Because if not me, then who?
None of these are particularly likeable traits in a protagonist. Video games have a long history of trying to make the player feel cool, and a big part of that is having them inhabit a cool protagonist. Connor is not envisioned this way. Sure, his outfit and his fighting skills are supposed to look cool, but in terms of his personality, he does not line up with our traditional ideas of what a cool guy is. Not like Ezio with his suave womanizing and confidence. Connor spends most of the main story yelling at people, particularly yelling at his mentor Achilles. Like a petulant child, it's not an overly endearing trait, especially because he's usually wrong in these arguments. But now, with a lot more age and wisdom, that exact aspect of Connor is what makes him so interesting to me. The fact that for about 80% of the game, he's wrong. Video games generally do not let a protagonist be wrong about things, or if they are, the player is supposed to be tricked as well. But the player and the character should never be in disagreement about things as a general rule. A rule that Connor flatly breaks. He often acts and does things that are illogical and emotionally driven, things that are obviously the wrong decision, and that's because Connor is written first and foremost as a person, and not as a vessel for the player. Which is surprisingly rare amongst game protagonists, at least it was in 2012. It's one of those things where you don't really understand context until you've lived a few years and have a more grown-up view of the world. Connor is a Native American living during the American Revolution. If you understand even a modicum of what that means historically, then yeah, No shit, he's grumpy all the time. When I was a kid growing up in bonny Scotland, I didn't know what that meant, or why Connor even existing at all was such a big deal. I talked earlier about how American history and culture is dominant in the English-speaking world, but there is a blind spot, and that's Native American history. And having went to high school in North America, I understand why. In 4 years of high school in Canada, we spent a single day on Native history, and that was only because my history teacher went rogue and thought it was important to touch on residential schools during Native History Month. He dedicated a lesson to residential skills, which was both informative and horrifying. But other than that, absolutely nothing. It's my impression of North America that Native Americans are a taboo subject that people would rather not talk about. Because no matter which way you cut it, it's an absolutely miserable subject. It's a story of constant betrayal, war, abuse, and genocide. There is no way to talk about it in a way that paints America, or Canada, in a favourable light. So for the most part, people don't talk about it. This applies especially to the American Revolution. It's the history of white American guys fighting white British guys, blue coats versus red coats. That's the history as it's usually portrayed in movies like The Patriot starring Mel Gibson. Movies, at least mainstream movies, that acknowledge the existence of Native Americans at all are rare, and those that do generally have a less than helpful portrayal, like in old westerns where they mostly exist to add an element of exoticism and danger to the Wild West. Not really as an actual people with an actual culture. As a Western, this is the legacy that Red Dead Redemption inherits. The game does feature Native Americans, but they have no specific tribe or culture. They're just one of the many gangs that dot the open world, although Red Dead does at least try to layer in some social commentary. I point this out not to name and shame anyone, but to illustrate just what a risk Assassin's Creed 3 was actually taking. There was no expectation whatsoever for the game to include a Native American perspective on the game at all, let alone centre the entire story in that perspective. The game could have easily and probably would have been better reviewed if it had taken the traditional approach that people would expect. A stoic white guy fighting for freedom from English tyranny. It could have had a protagonist like Haytham Kenway.
Invitation, please. Shall I take your coat, sir?
One of Assassin's Creed 3's most interesting and most controversial creative decisions is that the story does not begin with the main character, the guy on the box, but 2 decades earlier with his father during the French and Indian War, an English gentleman by the name of Haytham Kenway. This entire aspect of the story was kept a total secret from the game's marketing, and it's not just the prologue either. The first 3 chapters of the game are entirely dedicated to Haytham. 4 hours at least, if you're not rushing it. What's interesting about this secret is that I think it was a terrible idea, because the Haytham sequences actually work a whole lot better with context. In fact, I think they're way more enjoyable in a second playthrough once you know the twist. The story sees Haytham's arrival in America, establishing allies, and meeting the woman who will become Connor's mother, all while searching for the same temple that Desmond and company just found in the modern day. The twist, revealed at the end of Sequence 3, is that Haytham isn't an assassin, but a Templar, a reveal that totally recontextualizes everything in the game up to that point. Haytham is a protagonist exactly like Ezio. He's charming, sarcastic, elegant, and cool in that distinctly English gentleman sort of way. He's also got one hell of a white saviour complex. Narratively, this introduction kind of messes with the pacing, and for a lot of players means Connor starts off on the back foot because you've just spent 4 hours getting to know a bait-and-switch protagonist. But the Haytham sequences are also important because it's trying to do 2 very important things. One is that it's making a genuine effort to solve Assassin's Creed's villain problem, which is to say that all of the villains in the previous games, particularly the Ezio trilogy, are nothing more than mustache-twirling bad guys. Quick, who's the villain of Revelations? You've already forgotten, haven't you? By spending time with the villains in this way, getting to see them as people with actual motivations and personalities, it cements much harder why the Templars exist and why they believe the things they believe, because Assassin's Creed 3 is as much a deconstruction of the Templars as it is the Assassins. But the second and more important thing that this introduction does is mess with players' expectations, showing how easy it is to root for the bad guy just because they have a charming smile and noble intentions. One of the things you do as Haytham is free a bunch of Native American slaves, including Connor's mother, a completely and unquestionably noble thing to do, right? On your first playthrough, yes. On your second playthrough, it's more complicated than that. If you pay closer attention to the reasons you're freeing those slaves, it's not just to be noble, it's a favour, and Haytham expects to be paid back.
I've only seen such markings in one other place.
Where?
Well, it is forbidden for me to speak of it.
I saved your people. Does this mean nothing to you? Look, I am not the enemy.
The prologue is full of little moments like this, hints that Haytham might not be the noble hero he appears to be. Moments where his mask slips and you see the cold, merciless man who lies just beneath the surface. The assassins make a big deal about honouring the dead, that's why even to the biggest monsters, Ezio utters a word of remembrance after every kill. Haytham shows no such respect. But it's really in his interactions with the natives and with Connor's mother, Zio, that the cracks really show on a second playthrough. Because he doesn't view them, or anyone really, as people. He views them as a resource, a tool to be used against his enemies and to his own ends. He doesn't value their culture, he doesn't value any sort of claim they have on the land. He just wants them to share their secrets, and working with them is more efficient than torture. But it's so easy to trick yourself into seeing more in him, a similar trap that Connor himself falls into later in the game. He's easy to root for because he's nice, charming, and cool, and he has tender moments with Zio. In her own words, maybe he did love her and care about her, but he doesn't care about her culture or her people. The other Templars call them savages, and Haytham never disagrees, because he believes it's true. He likes Zio, he admires her bravery and her beauty, but he views her as inferior to himself, with his fine clothes and stone buildings and guns, and most likely, you think that too. There's an old phrase in US history, it was technically coined 100 years after when this game was set, but the ideals apply. Manifest destiny. It's the driving belief of the American expansion of the 19th century, that America was destined by God to expand and spread democracy and capitalism across America, and that was the true and divine way of things. Or, to put it more simply, we're better than the people who live here, and they'd be better off with our culture instead. I'd love to say that's a purely American belief, but it's really not. Residential schools operated all over Canada, buildings set up explicitly to re-educate native kids out of their cultural history. And the scariest part? The last of those schools closed in 1996, only 3 years before I was born. It's easy to condemn this stuff. The cruelty of these places and these historical actions is horrifying. Every few years it seems like they dig up another mass grave of children. But if you're white anyway, there's a little voice in the back of your head that goes, but wouldn't they be better though? The colonists had better technology, better medicines, more advanced architecture and agriculture. Shouldn't they have given these things to the natives? Is that not a good thing to do? It's not racism, it's humanitarianism. There's a name for this one too, coined in 1899 by Rudyard Kipling. The white man's burden. The belief that it is our responsibility as noble and civilized white folk to colonize savage lands and bring civilization to them, whether they want it or not, because it's for their own good. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed, go bind your sons to exile to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness or fluttered folk and wild, your new-cut sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Take up the white man's burden, in patience to abide, to veil the threat of terror and check the show of pride, by open speech and simple 100 times made plain, to seek another's profit and work another's gain. And then it goes on like that for 5 more verses. It is a fundamentally white supremacist belief, one that sees white European culture as explicitly better than anything else. There is no burden. The desire to help comes from us assuming that there's a problem to solve and not having brick buildings and churches to Jesus. But that's not a problem that the native people were actually complaining about. It's a projection of one's own values onto a situation where they do not apply. To get back to the fiction of Assassin's Creed, it's a philosophy that matches perfectly with the Templars. The Templars across all Assassin's Creed games are driven by the belief that humanity is fundamentally cruel, and the only way to stop war and violence and exploitation is through subjugation. It's a little more generalised than the white man's burden, but the philosophy is the same. We know better than you do, and we're going to make your life better whether you like it or not. That's why Haytham could never be the protagonist of this game. Not just because he's one of the baddies, but because fundamentally a white European cannot be the good guy in this scenario. He cannot fight for freedom on a land that isn't even his to fight for, fighting for a people who never asked to be fought for. Haytham is fictional, but his ideas and beliefs, specifically when it comes to the native people of America, are absolutely true to real history. The subsequent 200 years are more than enough proof of that. And that comes to the biggest problem with Assassin's Creed 3, at least if you're approaching the game in the traditional video game way, where video games are supposed to be fun or something. Assassin's Creed 3 is a massive bummer the entire way through. It's not a story of glory and heroism, it's a tragedy, because the driving force of Assassin's Creed 3's narrative is futility. There's a bad tendency when talking about Native Americans to treat them as one big group, but this is inaccurate to history. America is massive, and across its continent there are many different nations and different cultures and different languages. Our stereotypical view of natives with the big feather headdresses comes mostly from the Plains tribes, like the Cheyenne or the Comanche. But Connor specifically belongs to the Kanai-Kahaka tribe, known to us as the Mohawk, something which Ubisoft went to great care to make clear and represent appropriately, including an entire sequence of the game spoken almost entirely in the Mohawk language. That's a much more impressive feat than it sounds, considering that the Mohawk language is considered a culturally endangered language with less than 4,000 people in the world who know how to speak it. Pretty much all of the actors, including Connor's voice actor, had to learn the language for the game. The language coach, a guy called Aquirateka Martin, was also a cultural consultant on the game, and according to him, he was given a wide amount of creative control on the game when it came to correct representation and respect for the culture and language, given total freedom to edit the script to make sure it was as authentic as possible. Noah Watts, the voice of Connor, isn't Mohawk himself. He belongs to an entirely different tribe called the Crow. It's not exactly shocking that they couldn't find a Mohawk actor though, considering that there's less than 40,000 Mohawk in the world according to recent census data. I point these things out not just to make you feel bad, but because for the most part it's things we all already know. It's estimated that anywhere between 5 to 15 million people lived on the American continent before the Europeans arrived, and by the 19th century the native population was less than 250,000. It was a genocide. Even factoring in extenuating factors like smallpox, what happened to the Native American peoples fits every definition of the word. Assassin's Creed is a series about history. In a certain sense, you always know what's going to happen, provided the games line up to real history, which even if they get the details wrong, they usually do keep the broad strokes the same. This isn't a Wolfenstein Divergent Timeline situation. Connor and his people's future is already set in stone. Connor's primary motivation is to save his people, and we know that he's doomed to fail. Assassin's Creed 3 uses that dramatic irony to punctuate the entirety of its story. Yeah, it's a downer. That's the point. Nobody, unless they're completely ignorant to history, can go into this game and expect things to work out well for Connor. It's the fact that he tries so hard anyway that makes the game such a tragedy, because Connor's fatal flaw as a character is naivety. Connor sees the world in black and white. He sees the precarious situation his people are in, how the Europeans pose a threat to their very existence. He watched his mother burn alive after an unprovoked attack on his village, not exactly an uncommon story for the time. But he views the solution to that problem in simple terms. If I kill all the bad guys, the problem will go away. It's an almost comically simple philosophy when put like that, and yet it's kind of the driving force of the Assassins as an institution. Isn't killing all the bad guys until the problem goes away exactly what Altair and Ezio do? The Assassins are freedom absolutists. They fight against tyranny and injustice in all its forms, and they kill bad people to protect good people. Assassin's Creed 3 doesn't accept that as a good enough solution, because the real world doesn't work on that kind of black and white morality. If the Assassins were real, then clearly their solution doesn't accomplish anything. History is full of atrocities which just by sheer volume can all be the result of the Templars' influence. What can the Assassins do about the fundamental truth that some people just suck? The Templars have an answer to this question. Under their control, everyone will be happy and equal. It's a bad plan, one that equates to global slavery, but it's a plan. The Assassins don't have a plan, they have hopes and dreams. The entire organisation echoes Connor's own naivety. Just kill all the bad people. That plan is only effective if the entire structure of the society isn't the bad people. Assassin's Creed 3's load-screen death speeches have more bite to them than the previous games because most of the time they make points that are genuinely hard to argue against. Points which Connor himself doesn't know how to argue against. Even the worst amongst them, like Thomas Hickey, who has no philosophical ideas or moral justifications, he did what he did for the money, still makes a point that's hard to argue against.
You chose to side with men who would rob us of our humanity simply because it was more profitable?
What else is there? I'm not some blind fool to give up all I've got on principle. What is principle anyway? Can you bring it to the bank? Don't look at me like that. We're different, you and I. You're just some blind fool who's always chasing butterflies. Whereas I'm the type of guy who likes to have a beer in one hand and a tea in the other. Thing is, boy, I can have what I seek. Had it even. Your hands will always be empty.
The world is full of Thomas Hickeys, people who will do bad things with no moral qualms just because it benefits them personally. That's a fact of life. It's something that comes along with freedom. What can the assassins do about that other than kill every single Thomas Hickey in the world? Because that's not a real solution. Connor spends the majority of the game helping the revolutionaries. I've seen this described in a few places as him Forrest Gumping his way through history, which is about right, as the game has Connor just happen to be there for a huge amount of famous moments in the Revolutionary War. He was at the Boston Tea Party, he was there when the first shots were fired at Lexington, he was there at the signing of the Declaration, he was there at the Battle of Bunker Hill, and he was riding shotgun for Paul Revere during his famous ride, in what has to be one of the jankiest missions in the whole game. This is, historically, a little weird, considering that the Mohawks supported the British during the war, something which Connor's childhood friend, Canon Dogon, even brings up in the game, but it's a byproduct of Connor's naivety. The Sons of Liberty love to talk about freedom. They espouse a lot of the same ideals about freedom from tyranny that Connor believes. Even his extremely cynical mentor Achilles falls for it as well. He sees the world in black and white, so he can't fully comprehend a war where there isn't good guys and bad guys. The British are the more obvious bad guys, what with the oppression and that, so the Americans must be the good guys, right? Connor isn't totally oblivious. For example, early on, before the start of the war, he calls out Samuel Adams on the hypocrisy of owning slaves while talking about freedom.
Well, it's good to see the people finally taking a stand against injustice.
Says the man who owns a slave.
Ooh, sorry? I practice what I preach, my friend. She's not a slave, but a freed woman, at least on paper. Men's minds are not so easily turned. It's a tragedy that for all our progress, still we cling to such barbarism.
Then speak out against it.
We must focus first on defending our rights. When this is done, we'll have the luxury of addressing these other matters.
You speak as though your condition is equal to that of the slaves. It is not.
Tell that to my neighbor who was compelled to quarter British troops, or to my friend whose store was closed because he displeased the crown. The people here are no freer than Surrey.
You offer excuses instead of solutions. All people should be equal, and not in turns.
It's in turns, or not at all. We must compromise, Connor, however painful that may be.
Connor's naivety is not that he ignores the cruelty of the revolutionaries, but that he takes them at their word when they say they're going to fix it later. Historically, Sam Adams was a slave abolitionist, but not enough to, do anything more about it than personally not own any slaves. And despite his big talk about fixing those problems later, you may know that Samuel Adams is not remembered as the man who ended slavery in America, something which didn't happen for another 100 years. Most importantly, Connor falls head over heels for the myth of George Washington, this larger-than-life figure uniting the colonies and fighting for the freedom of all men.
I know that the people wish to be free, and that men like Washington fight to make it so.
This is what I meant when I said that Connor and the player end up in disagreement, because I know things that Connor doesn't know. I know that George Washington is not a friend to the Mohawk people, and that Connor's continued belief in the man is misplaced and will backfire horribly. If you're viewing the game as just a video game and not as a story, then this disagreement can be immensely frustrating, because you end up having to do stuff that Connor wants to do, and not necessarily what you want to do. The game has a deft hand for weaving in that manipulation on the part of the Founding Fathers, particularly with Sam Adams. They're always able to spin a tale where actually Connor's goals and their goals are aligned. Not even necessarily intentionally, but it's still clear what they're doing. It's interwoven with how the game tackles racism, which is to say that it doesn't, at least not in the traditional people yelling slurs sort of way. There's a little bit of that, particularly in the prison sequence, but for the most part people aren't bigoted towards Connor, they're condescending to him. People talk down to him and dismiss his concerns as less relevant than their own. Something which the game draws attention to several times is this condescending shoulder grab that a bunch of people do to Connor, which he always reacts negatively to. It's the "listen to me kid, I know better than you do" shoulder grab. No matter how many times he helps them, how friendly they act, Connor will always be an outsider to them, and his concerns and his people will always come second to their own. Connor isn't even his real name, it's just the name they all know him by because his real name is too hard to pronounce. And of course, when they do have the power to exert, that's when you see the claws come out.
You are a nothing, a speck of dust. You and all your ilk, living in the dirt like animals, oblivious to the true ways of the world. The wiser among you recognize the shape of the future. They throw themselves at our feet and beg mercy. But not you, it seems. No. You cling desperately to your ways, too ignorant to know your folly. But I am not unkind.
This is all heavy, dark, and often depressing stuff, and it makes up pretty much the entirety of the main campaign experience, which, if you choose to blaze through the main story at the expense of everything else, leaves you with a very morphed version of Connor as this purely tragic and angry figure who never ever smiles. But that's not the case. Connor can and does smile, it's just that the later and happier moments of the game are exclusively tied to the expansive side content of the game world. While the primary evolution of Assassin's Creed 3 is the outdoor focus, what you do in the world has also seen a lot of shifts from the previous games. Most of the stuff established in Brotherhood is still in there in one form or another, but reworked and reimagined for the new setting and time period in a way that Revelations failed to do. Take, for example, the city liberation and assassin recruit systems, both of which are still in the game but completely recontextualized. Towers have been replaced by more period-appropriate military forts, which you can capture for the Patriots, and the assassin recruit system has taken the ideas of Revelations and expanded on them immensely. No longer are your recruits randomly generated NPCs, but distinct characters with their own backstories and their own mission chains. Each district of the two cities has some sort of minor Templar plot, with the local trying their best to fix the issues. And once you've helped, they'll join your cause in a system that's honestly closer to an RPG party than the old spreadsheet approach. Those recruits also serve as a direct contrast to the bleakness of the main story. Just as the world is full of Thomas Hickeys, the world is also full of Clipper Wilkinsons or Dobby Carters, people who strive to do good for no other reason than it's the right thing to do. Pretty much all of the side content maintains a lighter tone. For example, one branch of side missions is the Frontiersman, where a mountain man type guy will spin a tall tale of some crazy Sasquatch man living out in the hills. And when you go to investigate yourself, you find not a monster man, but just an antisocial guy with a bad case of kleptomania. Or how about the game's big gimmick feature, the one that would turn out to be one of the most important additions to the franchise going forward, Connor's turn as a ship captain. Outside of just a few story missions, the naval combat is almost entirely optional, but there is a good reason to do it, and that's that it's fun as hell. It's clearly not accurate to how real naval combat goes, but it's done in such a way that it feels intensely engaging and fun. It's just satisfying to turn this big wooden brick on choppy seas trying to line up your shots to unleash a rippling broadside. And it's something that no other game I can think of had ever tried to gamify in this way before. My favourite features in any game are usually the ones that nobody would miss if they weren't there, because those are the things that are always a risk that require you to push boundaries. Nobody would think to put a full naval combat simulator into a third-person stealth game. Nobody would be asking for it if it wasn't there. Yet they did it anyway, and it's gone on to be a fan-favourite feature of the franchise at large. With the time period, the vibe is less Pirates of the Caribbean and more Master and Commander, even though your quartermaster, Mr. Faulkner, is literally voiced by that guy from those movies playing pretty much exactly the same character.
Come aboard and feast your eyes, boy.
No, not the left foot. Never the left foot. Horrible look. Step with your right foot first.
Future games enhance some of the finer details of the naval combat, but they absolutely nailed the foundations on the first go-around. It's not the sort of thing you'd expect to see a character like this doing, and yet over the years, Connor develops a taste for the open sea and an entirely different aspect to his career as an assassin. With that taste for the seas also comes a taste for exploration in this game's treasure hunt, chasing down the lost pirate treasure of Captain Kidd. And with the Aquila as permission to expand beyond the United States, they're by far the most exotic of the series so far, including Mayan pyramids, the frozen North Sea, and a spooky castle, all with no shred of cynicism or commentary, just the joy of exploration and adventure. But the true gems of the side content are all tied up in what I consider to not even be side content at all, at least not if you want the full Assassin's Creed 3 experience, the homestead. After Connor leaves his village to train and become an assassin, he starts living at the Davenport homestead. Initially just an old crumbling manor on the hill with an old crumbling man living in it. But as the years go by, Connor starts to build a whole community around it, various strays and outcasts from society for one reason or another, given a new chance and a sense of belonging here on the homestead. This is the evolution of the villa in Assassin's Creed 2. Now instead of just spending money to rebuild the shops, you're creating a whole community from the ground up. The homestead is the place where Connor feels truly safe, represented visually by him always wearing his hood down while there. This is the final evolution of the cozy game design that started in Assassin's Creed 2. We've now officially gone full Animal Crossing. It's all, for the most part, absolute domestic fluff, helping to herd pigs or breaking up a fight between the lumberjacks or assisting the doctor in treating some wounded sailors. All very low stakes, but these quiet domestic moments allow for an entirely different aspect of Connor's personality to shine through. The reason Connor is always angry and yelling in the main story is that he's a guy with no filters. He's open, honest, and he says what he thinks regardless of social etiquette. In the negative places the main story takes him, that's usually a bad thing, but in these quiet, peaceful moments, it can be quite endearing. Connor is not a traditional leading man. He's kind of shy and awkward and humble, constantly downplaying his own accomplishments. But deep down, he's just a fundamentally kind guy. He likes helping people, and there isn't anything more to it than that. That inherent kindness is what makes him so susceptible to manipulation. But the homestead is free of that sort of thing. It's a place where everyone works together and everyone helps each other. Some of my favourite interactions in the game are from the homestead's romantic subplot, not for Connor himself, but between Norris the French miner and Miriam the huntress. Norris asks Connor for help, and it becomes quickly clear that Connor has absolutely no idea how to engage with romance whatsoever.
One shot. Confident and precise. Incroyable. I like her.
She is a good friend. We all do.
Not like that, Connor.
Oh. Well, good for you.
Good day, Connor.
Norris is trying to court a woman. What do you women like, in terms of gifts?
I get why people think Connor is boring. He isn't Ezio by any metric. When you see him outside of the intensity of the main story, he's a quiet and contemplative guy. He's an introvert, and introverts, despite making up the majority of gamers, are extremely rare in game protagonists. I think once you dig beneath the surface though, he's a much more three-dimensional character than Ezio ever was, and he feels more real to me than Ezio with his larger-than-life persona ever really did. He's a character who's constantly fighting, but the homestead missions demonstrate exactly what it is he's fighting for. It is, in essence, the perfect vision of what America could be in miniature. A place where men, women, people of all colours and backgrounds are equal and work together for the betterment of the community. There is no racism, there is no sexism, there's just mutual understanding and cooperation. It's usually all quiet and peaceful, but when Ellen, the tailor's abusive ex-husband, comes to town looking for her, everyone in town who knows how to fight will be there in an instant to defend her. When a priest passes through looking for a place to settle, the whole town pitches in to help him build his church, not just as a place of God, but as a gathering place for the whole community, regardless of their own beliefs. This is Connor's vision in action. This is what he assumes the Sons of Liberty are fighting for. A nation, a world that looks like this. The main story and the homestead exist on two extremes of tone, but together they form a complete picture. Because reality is not entirely bleak or entirely sweet. It's a messy, uncomfortable mix of both. And it makes it all the more important to treasure that sweetness when you find it. It is a bittersweetness though, not because of anything in the game, but because of real life. You know, deep down, that the homestead cannot last forever. Racism, sexism, distrust of foreigners, these things persist into the modern day. Eventually the homestead is destined to be swallowed up by America at large and forgotten to history, as much a secret as the Assassins or Templars. While the homestead and most of the side missions show a brighter side of history, Assassin's Creed 3 does not shy away from the dark realities of history either. I don't know this for a fact, but it feels like Assassin's Creed 3 has one of the most expansive databases in the whole series, probably because it's such a well-documented period of history. But as in previous games, the database entries are all written by Sean, the only non-American on the team, and he makes a point of not sugarcoating anything because he doesn't share the American patriotic view of the Founding Fathers. He and Desmond even get into several fights about it.
I keep trying to understand how men like Washington and Jefferson could dedicate their lives to the pursuit of liberty and equality, yet have no problem owning slaves. It's hypocritical in the extreme, and your history books make only passing mention of the subject, as if it were of little consequence.
They had a war to win, country's future to secure. How could they deal with all these issues at the same time?
Spoken like a true apologist. We hear it today, too, that matters of civil rights and equality must wait. There are conflicts to settle, economies to salvage. What do any of these things matter if the people are not free and equal? All of them.
God, remember when Assassin's Creed was better back when it wasn't woke? Undoubtedly, some of this perspective on the revolution comes from the fact that Ubisoft Montreal, in case the name wasn't a dead giveaway, aren't American themselves, and naturally can present a slightly more cynical take on the Founding Fathers without fear of backlash. But I don't think it's as simple as the game just saying these great men were monsters, actually. It's the messy reality. These men were both great men and monsters in equal measure, depending on who you were and who you are. And none of them demonstrate that better than the game's own fictional founding father. Haytham might be out of the player 1 spot after the prologue, but he still has an important role to play in the back third of the game. One of his Templars has gone rogue and is causing trouble for the revolution, so Connor and Haytham form a shaky alliance to track him down. Just like many other times, this is something that you know is going to end up backfiring for Connor. Haytham simply cannot be trusted, and yet there's still that part of you, and certainly that part of Connor, that wants to see more in him than is actually there. The person Connor really hates is Charles Lee, Haytham's second in command. He's the one who led the attack on his village which killed his mother. Haytham, on the other hand, is his dad, and he's still the same charming gentleman that he ever was. And because of that charm and that willingness to cooperate, Connor starts to hope that maybe there could be peace between them, that he doesn't have to kill his own dad. It's a naive belief, but you can see why Connor wants so badly to believe it, because in a way you as the player want to believe that too, that Haytham can in some sense be redeemed, and there's little hints where it seems like they're almost actually getting along and supporting each other, right up until the moment where Haytham executes a prisoner, and then it's all back to square one again. The interactions between Haytham and Connor are some of the best in the game because of the way that they dance around each other. Their personalities and perspectives on the world are total opposites, but both of them are trying to reach out and trying to kindle some kind of connection with their only family. But ultimately, there is no reconciliation. Back in the modern day, Desmond and William can reconcile their differences because at the end of the day they both believe the same things and seek the same goals. Haytham's philosophy of control, that men are weak and need a shepherd to guide them, is fundamentally at odds with Connor's vision of a world like the Homestead. No peace could truly last that would unite these two ideas. One side would have to convert, and they're both far too stubborn for that. But they both try anyway, and it ends up being Haytham's last attempt that breaks Connor's naivety forever. Connor and Haytham have both come to warn Washington of an imminent attack by the British, news which Washington seems quite thankful to hear, having come to trust Connor quite a bit. However, as they're chatting, Haytham takes a look at the letter he was just writing. Turns out he just ordered an attack on Connor's village because he heard that they've sided with the Loyalists and he wants to put them down before they have a chance to attack. And, to add insult to injury, Haytham reveals that it was Washington that gave the order to attack his village 14 years ago as well.
And so now you see what happens to this great man when under duress. He makes excuses, displaces blame, does a great many things, in fact, except take responsibility!
Enough! Who did what and why must wait. My people come first.
Then let's be off.
No. You and I are finished.
Son.
Do you think me so soft that by calling me son I might change my mind? How long did you sit on this information, or am I to believe you discovered it now? My mother's blood may stain another's hands, but Charles Lee is no less a monster, and all he does by your command. A warning to you both. Choose to follow me or oppose me, and I will kill you.
Throughout the whole game, Connor had been operating under the naive belief that if his village stayed neutral, then they would be safe. The war didn't have anything to do with them, right? And as long as both sides knew that, both sides would leave them alone. Even as the walls closed in and his people told him that the war was on their doorstep, he clings to this idea that he can fix it, that they should stay out of everything for their own good. He put his faith in the Patriots because he believed in their cause, or at least the cause they said they fought for, but now that naivety has caught up with him. He can save his village, but he'll never salvage their trust in him. He's been, for years, helping the very men that were about to annihilate them. He's a traitor to the very people he was trying so hard to protect. He's forced to fight his oldest friend, convinced that Connor has turned against them. And why wouldn't he be? Here he is, wearing their clothes, using the name they gave him, the weapons they taught him to use. He was an outcast from New England from his birth, but now, thanks to years of living amongst them, he's become an outcast to his own people as well. It's here that Connor finally realises that the Patriots are not his allies, and certainly not his friends. Haytham was right that this revelation would shatter Connor's naivety, but he miscalculated his response. Cynicism doesn't break Connor's idealism, it fuels it further. If the world will fight against his vision at every turn, then he's just going to have to fight even harder.
My father is dead. Charles Lee now leads the Templar Order in his place. I see now why ours is an eternal war. For each piece taken from the board, another is placed upon it. Back and forth we go. Across the world. Across the ages. Some days mine feels an impossible task. But I cannot afford to be consumed with doubt. The people need me. Now more than ever. I must stop the Templars. I will kill Charles Lee.
A common complaint people made against the game at the time was that Noah Watt's vocal performance is flat, but I don't think that's true at all. It's just a very different sound than we're used to hearing in a leading role. He doesn't speak like a hero, he's soft-spoken and uses an odd cadence when talking, a deliberate choice because English is his second language. He speaks in a formal and proper way, never using contractions, which can give his lines a data-like quality. There you go, take Star Trek reference off the bingo card. A sense of flatness can also come across from the Mohawk village scenes because they're all speaking Mohawk, and even to me, who doesn't know a single word of the language, it's clear that they're struggling with it a little because of the lack of emotion behind the words. When you do scenes in a language other than the one known by the audience, you already risk a disconnect because of the requirement for subtitles. But in this case, the bigger issue is emotional inflections. You can detect emotion by the inflections people put on certain words. Like when I speak like this, you can tell that I'm angry. Not because you can see my face, but because you can hear it in my voice. I'm doing an angry voice. This is much harder to do when you switch to a language that's not your own. Par exemple, je suis maintenant en colère en français. But you can still do it provided you're familiar with the language. However, you'll remember that most of the actors in this game don't know Mohawk, so they have the double task of speaking a language they don't know, obviously have no familiarity with, and trying to inject emotion into it. And most of it doesn't really come away, giving these scenes a very strange atmosphere.
Ya. Dewesek. I umjunhoza ne gaa.
Nekji, doni gariwesh. Ohniyo di ayugwagarunya de.
You can read the emotion in the lines, but you can't really hear it in their voices, and it comes across as kind of weird. I still give the game tremendous credit for doing it though, because language is one of the most important, if not the most important part of any culture. But it's also important narratively, because as the story goes on, it's a language that you hear less and less as Connor becomes more and more separated from the very people he's trying to protect. So for the final sequence of the game, Connor does away with the assassin hood. He shaves his hair into a wolf's tail and dons warrior face paint. He will kill Charles Lee, not as an assassin, not as a patriot, but as the Mohawk warrior he realises now he always should have been. It's too late now to save his village, but he's not a saviour anymore. He's a revenant.
You try so hard, but it always ends the same. Those who know you think you mad, and this is why. Even those men you sought to save have turned their backs on you. Yet you fight. You resist. Why?
Because no one else will.
He knows damn well by this point that killing Lee won't change anything, but at the very least he can prevent Lee from doing any further harm. There is no dramatic final speech, no load screen death. They both take a drink in a bar in the middle of nowhere, and Connor finally puts an end to him and walks away. No sense of satisfaction, no great relief, just a war finally coming to a bitter close. He gets his revenge, America gets its freedom, Desmond gets tricked by an ancient space princess, and then we have 3 extremely poignant epilogue cutscenes. Early in the game, Connor embedded a hatchet in a post of the manor. As he explains, when his people start a war, a hatchet is embedded in a post until the war is over. And there that hatchet stays for the whole game, until now. Connor limps out to it, still weak from his fight with Lee, and grabs it. He looks around for a second at the empty trees. The war is won, and it gained him nothing. He can fight the Templars, stop their shady schemes, but he can't fight the March of Time itself. The reason he sought out the assassins in the first place was because of Juno. She gave him a vision of the future, of his village in flames and his people scattered, and she told him that only he could prevent this future. She was lying. That future was inevitable regardless of what he did. To Juno, just like to the Patriots, Connor was nothing more than a pawn, a vessel by which Desmond Miles could get a key 250 years in the future. He removes the hatchet and throws it to the ground. The war he started is over, but the struggle will never truly be over. Next, he travels to New York to witness the British evacuation. People line the docks, cheering and dancing and celebrating their newfound freedom. And just for a second, Connor smiles. Then, as he turns to leave, he catches sight of the slave market opening for the morning, and that smile evaporates. To the colonists, the fight for freedom might be over, but to Connor, his people, and to the slaves, they've simply traded one oppressor for another. All his struggle, all the battles he won for the revolution, changed nothing. Finally, Connor returns home to his village, and there's nobody there but an old hermit resting by the fire. He explains the people left many weeks ago. The land was sold by the new American government, and the people were forced to relocate west. Selling land is a safer option than taxes right now, you see, because taxes are a little too English. You have to ease people back into that sort of thing. And that's where Connor's story ends. Not with a bang, not with a great victory or a great sacrifice, with a quiet conversation in his ancestral land. It wasn't lost to war, it wasn't lost to Templar schemes. It was lost because it's easier to sell land that isn't yours than introduce taxes. And for all his strength and all his ideals and all his rage, that's not a problem you can ever solve just by stabbing people. In the end, it was all futile. It's a completely crushing place to end things. Connor isn't completely alone. He has his assassins and he has the homestead, but those are his friends, not his family. After all, they don't even know his real name, and none of them will ever speak to him in his native language. Raton Hagedon is alone in all the ways that matter to him. If you view video games as pure escapism, if you want a game where you have fun stabbing people all the time, then Assassin's Creed 3 is a miserable slog that undermines your victories at every opportunity. But that's such a narrow view of video games to me. Video games are art, and art can and should strive to provoke emotions beyond fun. Connor's story is so meaningful because even if he's not real, his circumstances and his struggle are real, and we all know that. He's a genuinely good and kind-hearted soul. He deserves a happy ending, but we all know that he'll never get one. He'll never retire to a vineyard with a happy family, because in the new world he lives in, people like him don't get to own the vineyards. Just as Achilles told him before giving him the name Connor when he naively suggested that there was no difference between a black man like Achilles and a white man, what's true and what is aren't always the same. Connor didn't really understand those words when Achilles had first said them, but now he does, and it is a bitter truth to swallow. You might imagine that much like Revelations, the modern-day side of the story muddles and interferes with the heavy themes of Connor's story, but surprisingly it doesn't, because thematically they are linked. Desmond is fighting to save the world, and in a way so is Connor, just a different sort of world. And in the end, both of them are just as doomed to the endless fight. Part of Desilee's Adam and Eve spaceship plan would have also meant an entire game set in the modern day, starring Desmond the entire time. I think for marketing reasons alone it's clear why that would have never happened, but through Desmond's missions we get what will most likely be the closest we'll ever get to a full modern day Assassin's Creed game. And I think in that regard they do a great job of illustrating why we'll never get a full modern day Assassin's Creed game. It's really a combination of many things. For one thing, the unique selling point of the entire franchise is exploring history, and so a game set in the modern, semi-dystopian world of the games doesn't have the game's main selling point. Climbing around a boxing stadium in modern-day Rio just doesn't have the same allure as climbing the Royal Opera House in 1700s London. Secondly, the entire gameplay structure of the series just feels very strange in a modern setting, because the games are built around melee combat, and our modern conception of combat isn't. We're all about guns here in the modern day. And the game adequately demonstrates why that's a problem for the game when it gives you a modern pistol towards the end of the last mission, which is basically like giving you a Fallout mini-nuke launcher in terms of balancing. It turns out that bringing a gun to a knife fight does actually make it very easy to win all the fights. And begs the question why you haven't been using a gun the entire time. Ubisoft does make open-world stealth games set in the modern day. Far Cry 3 came out just a month after Assassin's Creed 3, but despite both being open worlds, they are very different open worlds. Modern settings require modern solutions, like cars and RPG launchers. Far Cry has an entirely different methodology to its open world and what the player does in it, a methodology that feels distinctly not very Assassin's Creed. Really, the closest we'll ever get to modern-day Assassin's Creed is the Watch Dogs franchise, but they don't feel overly Assassin's Creed-like either, because taking down a shady, sinister corporation might be on paper what Assassin's Creed is about, but in practice it's not what you spend 90% of your time doing, and not what the majority of players actually care about, including myself, if that wasn't clear. Desmond's action missions aren't necessarily bad, but they're not really amazing either. Positioned the way they are, they're more like chapter breaks, time to reflect on the much longer and more in-depth story of Connor. But thematically they do come together in the end, because just as Juno used Connor, she's also using Desmond. With the key in hand and the temple fully charged, the final solution to preventing the apocalypse becomes clear. Juno isn't dead, she found a way to survive across the millennia, and if Desmond gives up his life to free her, she can save the world. Minerva pops back up to argue against it, claiming it's better to let the world burn than let Juno be unleashed upon it, because something that becomes very clear is that Juno really, really hates humans. We are to her as Connor was to Charles Lee, animals living in the dirt. But Juno shows Desmond exactly what will happen should they let the apocalypse happen. There will be survivors and Desmond will become a teacher to them, a new Moses. But over time the meaning of his teachings will change, they will become corrupted, doctrine will become dogma, and the cycle of war and violence will begin all over again. Just like Connor, to struggle against the wheel of time is futile. What has been will be again. So Desmond chooses to give up his life, to release Juno, to choose an uncertain future over a certain past, and thus ends the saga of Desmond Miles. He remained a block of wood from beginning to end, but at least at the very end he was a thematically and narratively relevant block of wood, because Connor's fight and Desmond's fight are the same, 2 points along a connected path. The fight for freedom, equality, and unity is never ending, and it's never easy. But the most important point, regardless of where or when, is that you never give up the belief that a better world is possible, no matter how hard it is or how out of reach it seems. Even if it is futile, even if you can't change things, there are some things that are worth fighting for no matter what the circumstances are. Because, hey, just because Connor is doomed to always struggle, what with him being 250 years old and fictional, doesn't mean that you can't make a difference in the here and now. It is exceptionally rare, especially these days, to see such a clear political message in a Ubisoft game, where they love to insist they don't make political games. Assassin's Creed 3 is a critique of the very core of American values, that for all its talk of freedom, its ideals of equality, it's built on a hypocrisy that remains strong to this day. Even the game's existence as a video game with a Native American protagonist is a statement. According to Wikipedia, there's only 17 video games with a Native protagonist, and even amongst that list, some of the inclusions are very questionable. I mean, 2 of them are Assassin's Creed 3. It's a game of many faults, and according to some unconfirmed reports, an absolute hellscape nightmare to put together. But at the end of the day, its creative vision and holistic approach to everything in the game is just rare amongst video games, especially Ubisoft games. They did not have to do this, nobody was expecting them to do this, but they took the same care and attention to detail they took to Rome and took it to a culture and a people that the modern day would prefer not to think about, to not see as real people but just a lost fragment of history. And that really, truly matters so much more than getting the dimensions of the Colosseum perfect. Of course it didn't have to be that way, they could have leaned more into what we expect a Native American hero to look like and be like, and they even gave us an extensive taste of that in one of the largest and strangest DLC expansions in the entire series. Set all the way back in Assassin's Creed 2, a trap that Assassin's Creed 3 was kind of forced to deliver on at some point, which is that back in Subject 16's crazed ramblings it suggested that at some point George Washington had an Apple of Eden, and of course, this being the game with George Washington, that was something that would have to be addressed. Instead of incorporating that thread into the main game where they figured, correctly, it wouldn't fit in at all, instead it's the entire basis for the game's big-budget 3-part DLC expansion, an Elseworld story where Connor is transported to a dark alternate reality, the Tyranny of King Washington, a reality where, using the power of the apple, Washington has gotten mad with power, declared himself king, and enslaved the people of America to do his bidding. Technically, like Brotherhood, there is another DLC pack that was exclusive to the PS3 release of the game, a short little mission pack dealing with Benedict Arnold, which is, frankly, extremely cheap feeling and a bit shit.
That the trader? It is. Major General Arnold will have further orders for you.
Sounds good. Welcome aboard, milady.
Yes, it turns out there's a traitor in the Revolutionary Army, and folks, you'll never guess who it is. Tyranny, on the other hand, is a full production, a total recontextualization of the entire game world. Each section, the Frontier, Boston, and New York, occupying an episode that are about 2 hours apiece if you're being completionist. All about Connor learning magical tree powers and fighting King Washington and his magical scepter. That crossbow though, thank God we got rid of that. It might be the most insane pivot of all time if, once again, Red Dead Redemption hadn't already laid the groundwork for this sort of thing with its own massive DLC which recontextualised the game world into a Weird West zombie apocalypse. I'm less certain on whether this one is just a coincidence or not. There is a big difference, however, when it comes to tone. Undead Nightmare is a comedy through and through, taking the extremely serious and done with this shit character of John Marston and sticking him in a ridiculous situation to see how he reacts. And the joke is that he reacts in exactly the same way he does everything else. There is an implicit understanding between the game and the player that none of this should be taken too seriously. The Tyranny of King Washington doesn't seem to understand this. It takes its Elseworld scenario completely seriously without understanding that in concept, this DLC is batshit crazy, which leads to an unresolvable clash of tones. And not in the creatively interesting way of the base game, just in ways that make the whole thing feel kind of pointless. The DLC opens with a very old, very famous quote. Power corrupts. Absolute power corrupts absolutely. This is the thematic message the DLC wants to convey, that a great man like Washington, when given absolute power, can and will become a tyrant. That might be a more impactful note to hit if Washington's integrity wasn't already completely scrutinised in a much more real and meaningful way by the base game. I've always found that power corrupts quote to be a very simplistic idea of morality. It strips tyrants of their own agency, that they were made that way by circumstance, and that it's just human nature that makes people into monsters when given absolute power. I much prefer the version that power reveals. Once you have absolute power, the world can see what you want to do with it, and what you value more, using the power, or keeping the power. But the DLC takes that original quote at face value, not only to the detriment of the DLC itself, but to the detriment of the base game as well. Washington isn't doing this because deep down he always wanted to be king. No, a magic evil ball whispered in his ear and convinced him to do it, so now you've got to put him down like a rabid dog. There's a lot about this DLC's alternate reality that doesn't make any sense at all, and that's a silly thing to complain about because it doesn't need to make sense, it's not real. But the fact that it's both not real and doesn't make sense makes it very hard to actually try and engage with. The timeline split happened at some point prior to the Revolution, but the Revolution still happened in much the same way, and Washington only went mad with the power of the apple sometime after. However, for some reason that meant that Connor never left his village, his mother never died, his father did die, and the Assassins and Templars are entirely absent from this whole scenario. The reason none of this makes sense is that it's all a dream. I mean, literally, that is the explanation. It's a dream that the apple is sharing with both Washington and Connor. Only for some reason Connor retains his knowledge and memories of the real world and Washington doesn't. So if the plot doesn't make sense, and none of this is real anyway, the only possible motivation left to go through it all is fun. Undead Nightmare understood that. But in a commitment to staying true to things, Tyranny is all played entirely straight-faced. It is a miserable, depressing alternate world, and the game wants you to feel that way about it. All the towns are in ruins, the people are starving, pretty much every friendly NPC in the game dies as you make your way through the story. There is no part of it, ever, that is supposed to be a joke. The visual of King George Washington pulling out 2 flintlock pistols to shoot Connor in the heart, then stabbing him with a musket to shoot him in the heart a 3rd time, is obviously a completely ridiculous visual. And yet the DLC wants me to take it seriously for some reason. I'm not supposed to find this funny, I'm supposed to find this scary and threatening. He's built a massive pyramid to his honour right in the centre of New York, and this amounts to nothing more than a trivia fact, really. What's interesting and slightly redeeming about all this is that as the story goes along, Connor becomes as disconnected from all as I do. A big part of the story, and one that again doesn't make any sense or even try to, is that by drinking the tea brewed from a magic tree, Connor can undergo sky journeys and unlock powerful magic abilities. These include turning invisible, flying like an eagle, or unleashing the strength of a bear. Each of these uses your health as ammunition so that you can't overuse them, and to represent how mechanically dangerous these powers are meant to be, but they are also 100% the primary reason to play the DLC, because it's an undeniable truth that having superpowers is pretty cool. After 30 hours with the base game, these new abilities do spice things up quite considerably. They're massively overpowered once you know how to use them, but that's honestly fine because it's the only part of the DLC where fun actually wins out over the self-seriousness of the whole thing, and the game throws tons more enemies at you to compensate. The sky journeys, especially the bear where it all goes a bit Shadow of the Colossus, are just kind of fun and weird without any desire to be more than that. The Mystic Mohawk superpowers are the only part of the DLC that actually engage with the Elseworld scenario in a properly fun way, except for the fact that the game wants to try and say something with those too. After all, power corrupts, right? So after gaining the powers, Connor's ego skyrockets for some reason and he starts to believe he can do anything before he's cut back down to size. It feels entirely out of character with everything established about him in the base game that gaining the power to turn invisible would suddenly make him into a narcissist, but here we go. It's also meant to come out in the way he becomes more and more inhuman as the DLC goes along. By episode 3, his eyes are black and he's showing a distinct lack of care for anyone or anything. He only cares about killing Washington, which I think is supposed to read as his corruption. But personally, I read it more as not giving a shit about this dream world anymore and wanting it to be over and done with. Which is a drive I can get behind. When we get to the final confrontation, Washington tries to be all, "Oh, but we're the same, you and I, you just want the apple for yourself," and I think the game wants me to think that's true, but I don't, so it all just falls a bit flat.
Well, the possession of the apple is both a burden and a blessing. Tell me, when you shake the earth, do you feel that you are a slave to the people? Or do you wish to be their master?
The people want you brought down.
But you didn't answer the question.
I am the only king here!
It wouldn't be impossible to have a deep and impactful theme in an Elseworld story like this, but it has to be something more elaborate than the trite proverb that power corrupts. That's not enough to sustain a 6-hour adventure, and especially not enough to follow up on Assassin's Creed 3. In the end, after their magic battle, they're thrown back to reality, where Washington nobly resists the allure of the apple and instructs Connor to throw it to the bottom of the sea, which he does. Then Washington has a fight with the phantoms of his own mind and proclaims proudly that he will never compromise the democratic values he fought for. And that's great, man. Call me when you've ended the slavery and the genocide. It's such a strange companion to the base game, which was all about showing the dark side of American history, where this DLC goes, "But look how much worse it could have been, be thankful for what you got, huh boys?" It undermines the entire point of the base game in a way that I don't think the writers really thought through. Someone wrote down King Washington on a blackboard and then they spiraled from that idea without taking any consideration for the implications it would have on the meta-narrative of the game at large, which frankly is very inconsiderate when you're trying to do a retrospective on the game 12 years after the fact. At the very least, it's a reminder of what risk really means. Risk presents the possibility of things going wrong. And a story about George Washington declaring himself King of America is a risk, just not one that paid off this time, at least not for me. In the end, the Tyranny of King Washington is a novelty that ultimately adds little to the overall experience of Assassin's Creed 3, but that is a risk when you create a game with such a tight focus. How do you add more stuff to a game that's already absolutely full of stuff? Creatively, Assassin's Creed 3 had already said everything it wanted to say, so the only direction left to go in is novelty. That might be a good thing in the long run, because even if the message of tyranny is actively detrimental to the base game, it's also a weird novelty that only exists to be weird. If you want to ignore it, you very easily can, just like many people did Assassin's Creed 3 itself for many years. I used to think Assassin's Creed 3 was the boring one. Many people did, and I think what's interesting about that is that Assassin's Creed 3 didn't change at all. This isn't like Fallout 76 where they added a bunch of stuff over the years and people gradually came back to the game. The game didn't change. We changed, and the game came into sharper focus along with it. The 2010s were, I think, looking back, a time when the games industry grew up, the end of the dude bro era of games, where games were only supposed to be cool and badass and sexy, into a period we're in now where games can be and are anything. Where we can see stories in the interactive medium that go beyond simple power fantasies. I'm not saying Assassin's Creed 3 kicked off that movement, but it was certainly riding the wave. It's a game that flatly rejects the notion that games should be apolitical, or that there's even an apolitical way to talk about history. Games are one of the most powerful mediums of art for storytelling, and they can enhance the message of a piece just by the virtue of being in an interactive world, because there is a difference between seeing a village on a screen and walking around that village, being in it, watching it firsthand transform from a place of life to a place of tax breaks. Because it takes such hard stances, and because it is such a downer for most of the time, Assassin's Creed 3 is doomed to always be somewhat controversial, because that's what happens when you take risks, but that's also when the most meaningful art emerges. Representation matters, as it turns out. How many people's first ever experience with Native Americans comes from Assassin's Creed 3? That's the thing about representation. Anyone could be someone's first, and that's why it's so important that people take away from Assassin's Creed 3's dedication to depicting the Mohawks with care and respect. That list I showed you before, only 3 of those games came out after Assassin's Creed 3. Hundreds of different tribes and cultures, hundreds of years of history, 3 video games. So maybe he is angry and moody and a little off-putting to some people, but I think there's a case to be made that Raton Hagedon is the most important protagonist in the entire series. Of course, that wasn't popular opinion at the time. Popular opinion was that he sucked. And while Assassin's Creed 3 was a commercial success, there was a genuine risk there of this being the downfall of the franchise. So what to do about that? Well, what's the opposite of taking a bunch of risks? Why don't we try that? But that's a story for another day. Thank you for watching, and a very special thank you to my wonderful patrons for your continued support. If you'd like to see your name up here or just support the things that I do, then please consider signing up. It would mean a lot to me. As well as a like, comment, share, subscribe, and ring the bell, because YouTube doesn't like to tell you when I upload videos anymore. To see the entire Assassin's Creed series critique, you can click up there. We're getting right into the thick of it now, so there's a good chunk of videos there. Or how about specifically you just click on the Assassin's Creed Revelations video, because that one got kind of buried and it could use some love.